Welcome back to the Jesus Discussion. We're glad you're joining us. Again, if you have questions, concerns, comments, critical thoughts, email us at questions@thejesusdiscussion.com. Now, our last episode, we did this overview of kind of where we've come, and really we focused more on two of the main themes that Mark may have been wrestling with in terms of, he's trying to say something, but there are these two tensions going on. Imagine if you were saying something that didn't resonate with the Republicans and it didn't resonate with the Democrats, and you had to say something and those two tensions are pulling at you, you would really pick carefully what stories you're telling and why and how in order to get your theme and your message across, because the gravity is so great between the polarization. So we talked a lot about those two themes that were kind of pulling at Mark as he's trying to communicate in the first century, and maybe some of the background with Isaiah. And now we pick up in Mark chapter 5, and we're going to go verse 21 through 43. Now, we're going to try something new, and if you've been listening, we invite you to be featured on the Jesus Discussion. To be honest, Everett, I just got tired of reading the verses. So I don't, it's one of those things where you got to like focus, and I'm trying to do it live, and I'm like, yeah, I don't know. You stumble over a word, but if you want to read a verse for us on the Jesus Discussion, just send us an email at questions@thejesusdiscussion.com, and we will send you a verse. And you can just record it on your phone and send us an audio file, whatever works, as long as it's clear. We'll communicate with you about that. So I went out and I got some of the listeners that I know that are in our area to read some of our next verses. And that's what we're gonna use for these next few episodes. But we invite you, be featured on the Jesus Discussion. Read a verse for us.
We get tired of listening to our own voices, is what he's saying.
Yeah, pretty much. That is exactly it. All right, so without any further setup, here is Amy reading Mark 5, verses 21 through 43.
When Jesus had again crossed over by boat to the other side of the lake, a large crowd gathered around him while he was by the lake. Then one of the synagogue leaders, named Jairus, came, and when he saw Jesus, he fell at his feet. He pleaded earnestly with him, "My little daughter is dying. Please come and put your hands on her so that she will be healed and live." So Jesus went with him. A large crowd followed and pressed around him, and a woman was there who had been subject to bleeding for 12 years. She had suffered a great deal under the care of many doctors and had spent all she had. Yet instead of getting better, she grew worse. When she heard about Jesus, she came up behind him in a crowd and touched his cloak, because she thought, "If I just touch his clothes, I will be healed." Immediately her bleeding stopped, and she felt in her body that she was freed from her suffering. At once Jesus realized that power had gone out from him. He turned around in the crowd and asked, "Who touched my clothes?" "You see the people crowding against you," his disciples answered, "and yet you can ask, 'Who touched me?'" But Jesus kept looking around to see who had done it. Then the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came and fell at his feet, and, trembling with fear, told him the whole truth. He said to her, "Daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace and be freed from your suffering." While Jesus was still speaking, some people came from the house of Jairus, the synagogue leader. "Your daughter is dead," they said. "Why bother the teacher any more?" Overhearing what they said, Jesus told him, "Don't be afraid, just believe." He did not let anyone follow him except Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. When they came to the home of the synagogue leader, Jesus saw a commotion, with people crying and wailing loudly. He went in and said to them, "Why all this commotion and wailing? The child is not dead, but asleep." But they laughed at him. After he put them all out, he took the child's father and mother and the disciples who were with him, and went in where the child was. He took her by the hand and said to her, Talitha Kaum, which means, little girl, I say to you, get up. Immediately the girl stood up and began to walk around. She was 12 years old. At this they were completely astonished. He gave strict orders not to let anyone know about this and told them to give her something to eat.
So the story that came before this passage, Everett, was when Jesus took the unclean spirit and cast it into the pigs, and then he gets back in the boat and he crosses over to the other side, and there's a large crowd around him. Now, one of the synagogue leaders, talk about what was the local synagogue scene like? So who was this guy Jairus, and how was he viewed among his peers?
The local synagogues, of course, the main focus of Jewish worship was always the temple in Jerusalem. But there were local houses of worship because if you lived far away from Jerusalem, you can't go there every Sabbath or every Saturday. So there would be local worship places that became known as synagogues, which is from the word basically to gather together. And they organized themselves by appointing their own leaders in the synagogue. And so one of these leaders is this man named Jairus. And so Jesus has come over from the Gentile country now to the Jewish side of the Sea of Galilee, and has this encounter with this leader of one of the local synagogues.
Right. And he concedes to, the synagogue leaders, help. She's sick. I don't know what to do. And it's not like they had absolutely no medicine or anything that they could do for anyone in the first century. This is a sick that's beyond, I caught a cold and I'm out for a day or two. And we talked about that before. It's really easy to look at ancient people as less intelligent or less capable of reason. But this is probably something that is has been maybe going on for more than a day or two with his daughter, and the signs are something that everyone recognizes are not good signs. So Jesus concedes and hey, I'm going to go. And right in the middle of that, here comes this woman who's been bleeding for 12 years.
Right.
Now, it's interesting that this happens with Jesus, and I believe Mark doesn't have the Lazarus narrative, correct? That's I believe Matthew and Luke might have that.
Luke has it.
Luke has it. That's it. Yeah. So, but even in all four of the Gospels, this isn't the only time where Jesus appears to be on his way to do something, and he gets approached by someone who has a need, and he just drops what he's doing and helps with that need that is right in front of him. So we've got this woman who's bleeding, and she reaches out and touches him, and he addresses her, and this is a little pause in the story. And then we've got this kind of narrative technique that Mark uses. He'll kind of have an aside in the middle of one of his stories. We saw this with the parables where, he has Jesus tell the first parable, then he jumps forward in time to a moment where Jesus has the disciples off to the side and is explaining things. And then he goes back to the scene where he's telling the parables. So we have a similar kind of literary device here with this woman in the bleeding and the healing. And there's a lot of difficult questions that surround this in terms of the concept of faith and, this whole story can create a lot of complicated questions. Everett, I'm sure you've dealt with some misconception about maybe what Mark is saying. How do we approach this difficult passage of, someone reaching out and touching Jesus and being healed? he's in a crowd and lots of people are bumping up around him. So why is this person healed? And what does that say about faith, and what is Mark trying to say?
Well, first of all, in Jewish culture and according to the Jewish law, contact with blood makes one unclean. So this woman is not only facing a medical problem, but that she is permanently barred from much of Jewish life and thought because of this continuous hemorrhage. So that the healing has a spiritual implication beyond simply the physical healing.
Right.
And so she touches, her thought is in verse 28, if I just touch his garments, which speaks of her faith. In fact, in verse 34, Jesus says, your faith has made you well, go in peace and be healed of your affliction. So that her faith was that the power to heal comes from Jesus. And so it wasn't, her faith isn't something magic. It's not like a potion or a bag of feathers you sprinkle over your head or something. It's confidence in Jesus that he is the healer and that he has the power to heal. And so he commends her faith. And it's interesting, as you said, Bob, he says, who touched me? And this crowd and the disciples even are kind of chide him for that. It says, look at the crowd all around you. It's kind of like you're at the sale table at a department store. People are crowding around you, and then you look around and say, who touched me?
Right.
But Jesus is aware of the situation and wants to make a point out of the fact that this is not a secret healing, that she has been restored both physically and spiritually to her community.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting because Jairus is a synagogue leader, and this woman would not be welcome in the synagogue because she's unclean. So
Right.
She doesn't get the opportunity to participate in her faith or the culture, on that level. Whatever participation or connection she has with God happens, maybe even outside of polite society. I mean, there are rules
Right.
about where you could go in this. It wasn't just you can't go to the synagogue. You're not going to go to the temple. You're not going to be anywhere around anyone where they're concerned about touching you, because touching you makes them unclean as well. Correct?
Yeah, and that applies to every person. It applies to your family, your friends, people in the marketplace. So it affects her whole life.
Mm-hmm.
And Jesus fixes all of that with this healing.
Right. There's another complicated element, and this is, in our last podcast, we talked about maybe reading too much in. Now, Mark has a theme of faith, but oftentimes we want to build up a doctrine of faith, and we want to look at this passage and not really hear what Mark is saying about how Jesus restored someone who believed in him. In contrast to Jairus, the synagogue leader, we have someone who Jairus is the one that all the local synagogue said, okay, you're our guy. You're going to organize the synagogue and lead what goes on there. And the woman is someone who's not even welcome anywhere near there. And so Mark is talking about the restoration, and then he goes back to what he does for Jairus. And he's not couching Jairus negatively, but there is a literary contrast that's poetic, I would say.
Right.
Now, but oftentimes we want to read more into it than Mark is saying and really get to, okay, now define faith, and how does faith work? And if I touch Jesus' garment, and what is there a magic touching of Jesus that if I do this and, stand on the correct way and face the right direction and go through the right, whatever, and then I'm going to be healed.
Right.
How do you, and maybe we should talk a little bit, Everett, about some ways that we get askew on the concept of faith, some ways that we can, that seem right until maybe you kind of think through them a little bit.
One of the things that we have to keep in mind is that you can't build a doctrine on one verse of the Bible or on one paragraph of the Bible. Doctrines have to take into account all that the Bible has to say on a subject. So it would be easy for us to say, well, faith made her well, so all I have to do is have faith and I'll be well. And that's not the point of this. The point is, in verse 30, the power goes out from Jesus, and the woman's attitude was that the power to heal is in Jesus, and that's her faith. There are occasions where it says, there's a crowd and they come for healing, and it says Jesus healed many of them. So I can't from this take that I have a right, because I'm a person of faith, to be in perfect health or anything like that. To do that goes way beyond what Mark is trying to convey here about Jesus having compassion on a woman and healing her physically and spiritually and healing her relationships because she comes to him in faith.
Mm-hmm. And the other thing is about the touching. Jesus doesn't always heal when you touch his clothes. He doesn't. The other people are bumping into him and they're not healed. If you try and go figure out all the ways that Jesus healed and ascribe some kind of thing to the physical elements, and this is where, things got crazy at times in Christian history about, and I don't mean to insult anyone if you're big into the artifacts or, the Shroud of Turin.
Yeah.
But you have to ask yourself, is that what Mark is trying to say? And
right.
Should we go pursuing these elements because and look, if I could dig in the ground in the Middle East for the rest of my life and learn things and know what I was doing, and I would find that really fun to find historic artifacts. And if I found something close to the disciples or Jesus, that would be even more fun, right? Exciting.
Right.
But I have to be careful. Am I ascribing power to Jesus, or am I ascribing power to an element of something?
Right.
So
right. And,
go ahead.
And this isn't the only way Jesus healed. Sometimes he just spoke a word.
Yeah.
Sometimes he spit in people's eyes. I'd have to have a lot of faith before I'd let somebody spit in my eyes.
I think the one that gets me is, didn't he spit on his hands and rub someone's tongue or something at one time?
Yeah, he touched the guy's tongue with his spittle, and that takes a lot of faith.
Yeah.
So you can't take from a single incident like this of Jesus healing and extrapolate to this is how it works. That's not, again, what you're saying is that's not what Mark is talking about here. He's not talking about this is how you can be healed of your diseases. Mm-hmm. He doesn't say that. And this is what we call a narrative account. It's a story about what something Jesus did. This is not Jesus teaching about healing. This is about an incident that happened. And we have to be very careful. We have to be very careful about building doctrinal ideas based on narrative or stories in the Bible. If I'm going to build my doctrine on something, I'm going to build it on the teaching, and then the narrative supports the teaching rather than the other way around.
Right. And we have a lot of, what do you call them? I guess parables. The boy who cried wolf, stories like that where in our culture, when we hear a story or a narrative, we're looking for the moral, and that's actually something that I was, formally taught in school. Read the story. Now, what's the moral of the story, right? And they would ask you that question on your English paper in elementary school, trying to get your what do you call that, critical reading skills or whatever.
Right.
And it can be really tempting then, like you say, you read through a narrative and you're like, okay, what's the moral? And maybe listen for what Mark is saying. And then if Mark is saying something that implies a moral, great. But if he's not, maybe it becomes really difficult when we read these books that, there are so many volumes and volumes, there's so much work written about trying to understand and make claims about what these ancient authors mean, that it's real easy just to get caught up in the noise of the discussion. And ideas about what Mark is saying or what the Bible is saying can be like trying to identify a particular cow in a field full of hundreds of cows. They all look the same, especially if they're like milk cows. Look, they're all white with black spots,
or black with white spots.
Black with white spots, or yeah.
There's a breed of cows that they're all black and there's a big white stripe around their belly and they all look the same.
Yeah, the idea, how you can get some sanity on that is you can kind of back away from the sea of ideas and just kind of go back and say, well, who was Mark and what was Mark saying? And let me really be a little bit more minimalist in what I think Mark is saying, and then step out from that with more caution.
Right. And if Mark is saying something here about how we are healed from whatever, then that's going to be supported in other places in the Bible. It's not going to stand alone. So one of the things we have to keep in mind is the context of not just what is going on here with Mark, but what is the rest of the gospel, what are the rest of his letter saying, and then expand that out to what is the rest of the New Testament saying, what is the rest of the Bible saying about, whatever it is that I'm looking at and trying to find the moral of the story. If the moral of the story is that this is the way we do something, then this is not going to stand alone. The rest of the Bible will support that moral.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you could go, and this is where understanding all of Mark helps you frame Mark, and then you add Mark and what Mark is saying to what other people are saying about some of the same things. But too often we want to get rid of Mark and take a few verses from Mark that happen to be about the same thing that someone else says.
Right.
If we're going to do a cross comparison to books, understand the whole book, because you could get lost, because it could be like opening up books in a library that all mention a same topic, not reading the whole book, knowing the author's point, and then quoting from these different, they're all different books and different writings. So we don't want to get sidetracked or outside on a lot of that. Now, I know we spent a lot of time talking about, how we can get kind of hung up in some of this detail, but it's a pretty powerful moment here. This is one of the stories that I think a lot of people who might not be familiar with other stories in the Bible or in Mark have likely heard this one. This one has traveled a lot because of what it is. But it's interesting because I get the impression from what Mark is saying that he didn't just say this one thing, daughter, your faith has saved you, go in peace and be healed from your affliction, but then he might have turned around and was teaching something, because it says while he was speaking. So maybe he just said the one line, maybe he said more, but you get the idea from verse 35 that Jesus' delay to deal with this woman has made him too late to heal Jairus' daughter.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, why bother him anymore? Go away. Let him do his thing. Jesus missed his window here because he was doing something else. And so it's good storytelling.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah, and verse 35 follows up on that when they come and say to Jairus, don't trouble Jesus any longer because your daughter's dead.
right. Yeah, just let him alone. Yeah, oops, too late. And so you get this narrative tension going on with, why are you stopping? His daughter's sick. And then you do this thing and you missed and you get the moment in the movie right before Act 3 where the hero fails, and you're like, oh. But good thing Act 3 is coming and the hero will emerge victorious. And I don't see this as Jesus failing, but it is that kind of a storytelling device.
Yeah.
Yeah. So then Jesus overhears and says, don't be afraid, only believe. And that doubles back on the same theme he was just telling the woman about faith.
Right.
So then he doesn't let anyone accompany him except his inside group, some of his inside group. And we get this scene, with a crowd making a commotion and weeping. And if you're not familiar with this, there were paid mourners in this culture in this time. Everett, you might know a little bit more about that than I could express.
Well, I think that's essentially it, is important people who had the means would actually pay people to come in and make loud mournings over someone who had died. And that was one of the ways they showed respect for the loss that the family felt. So it sounds a little odd to 21st century, Western people, but that was just sort of expected. And that's why you have this turning, because you've just lost someone who's dear to you and you're mourning. You're not going to turn around and start laughing at somebody. But if you understand that these are probably the paid mourners, that they're not expressing their own grief, they're trying to sympathize with someone else's grief.
Mm-hmm. So they're capable of laughing because they're in that state. Because otherwise, if you were actually someone who was mourning over this person and you were experiencing the emotion of loss and sorrow, then someone comes in and says they're not dead but asleep, you would either probably express shock or anger. You wouldn't laugh.
Right.
It wouldn't be levity.
Right. Right. It'd be, you get out of here.
Yeah.
Kind of thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So then he moves away from the crowd with just his disciples, which again speaks to what we were talking about in our last episode. He's not trying to say, look at me, look at me. He's trying to heal Jairus' daughter. And he's encouraging Jairus to have faith. And then he pulls away again from the second crowd who's just making a big commotion and laughing. And he pulls away from them. And it's just the child's father and mother who are with him. And they entered the place where the child was, right? And then he takes her hand and he says this Aramaic phrase, Talitha koum. Is that?
Talitha koum.
Talitha koum. Yeah. Little girl, I say to you, get up. Go ahead.
It's interesting to me, just as someone who's interested in history, that here we have Mark recording the very words of Jesus. We read the New Testament and we're reading an English translation of a Greek text, and Jesus probably was not speaking Greek. He was probably speaking Aramaic. And so we don't have very many places where we see the actual words that Jesus spoke. And here we have, he says in Aramaic, Talitha koum, which is, little girl, I say, get up, or it's time to get up.
Yeah, that's really cool. And even in other places where we see Jesus talking, he where we know it's likely actually a quote from Jesus might be quoting an Old Testament verse or a psalm or something. So this is just Jesus' words. And that's pretty
Right.
cool. That's pretty cool.
It is.
Yeah, we also have to realize too, and we've mentioned this before, but just as an aside, just because we don't have the precise words of Jesus doesn't mean that what we in many of these places where it's Greek that was written and then we've translated it to English, doesn't mean that the meaning of what Jesus was saying is not accurate to what Jesus was saying. It
Right.
was.
Right. And I mean, I strongly believe that God has superintended the process by which we have the Bible today. And we have it in Greek. And, there are people that say, well, we've got to get back to the Aramaic that Jesus was speaking, and it was probably this, and it could have been that, and it means something a little different. And I honestly believe that if that's what God intended, then we would have the Aramaic text. So that what I'm saying is that we can rely upon the text that we have, that Mark wrote in Greek for a reason, and recorded the words of Jesus in Greek for a reason. And I really think that God superintended that whole process.
Mm-hmm. And I know we can get carried away with being way too literal on the text, but I think you would agree with me when you say that when we say we can trust the text, I would argue we can trust the meaning of the text. I wouldn't want to. Leviticus talks about rabbits chewing cud. Rabbits don't chew cud. So I wouldn't want to go back into history and make a case for some time when rabbits chewed cud and their biology is now changed. I would just want to hear. Go ahead. But they do make a chewing sound. Yeah.
They do appear to chew the cud.
Right.
So unless you're a biologist or a zoologist, then if somebody talks about rabbits chewing the cud, if you've been around rabbits, you know exactly what they're talking about.
Exactly. And so it's the meaning of the text. It is not, and this is where we talk about the difference between accuracy and precision. So I'm not going to go in and micromanage and say, you got a scientific fact wrong. I know what he's trying to say. He's trying to say, those animals that make the chewy motion. And if in the ancient world, they didn't differentiate between the scientific definition that we have now of chewing cud or just making the chewing motion, I'm okay with that.
It's like where the Bible talks about sunrise and sunset.
Yeah.
Well, the sun does not rise. The earth turns on its axis. And if you believe in the flat earth, sorry about that. But people criticize the Bible and say, see, you got it wrong. So what would the Bible say? Well, when the earth rotated to a position where people could actually see the sun, that's nonsense. We all talk that way.
Yeah.
The Bible's not a book about science. It's not a book about genetics. It's not about biology. Why doesn't the Bible talk about dinosaurs? Because that's not what the Bible's about. It's not a zoology book.
Yeah.
And so we have to look at what the authors are conveying. But I think my point is that we can trust the Greek text. We don't have to look someplace else and say, well, Jesus was speaking Aramaic, so we need to find the Aramaic behind the Greek.
Yeah.
No, we don't.
No.
The texts we have are in Greek.
Mm-hmm.
And so we can rely on the fact that God, for whatever reason, and I think there are good reasons, but I don't want to go into it here, gives us the New Testament in Greek. And so we should just smile and be happy and say, okay, it's in Greek. I'm glad. I'm good for that. I'm good with that.
Yeah. I don't want to get too sidetracked like you said on this topic, and hopefully you're all still with us listening.
Sorry.
No, because you and I could geek out about this forever. I think we also don't really see Jesus fitting a personality. And I think some of that is I would agree, superintended is a word. I also think that, maybe the early disciples weren't really trying to convey either Jesus is something we can all model, or he's not. You know what I mean? And so I think there's some things within the text that I would agree with you are superintended. I guess that's all I'm trying to say. There's some things that aren't there and some things that are there. And I think we have what we need to have.
Right.
Yeah. All right. Well, I think that we have pretty much covered all we can really cover about this. It's just a reminder about the Messianic secret in verse 43. Hey, don't tell anyone, and give her something to eat.
Right.
So again, Jesus is not trying to be the miracle worker. And this is Mark. He has Jesus pretty much saying it flat out at times, and then he demonstrates a lot of how Jesus does this, and kind of pulls away from that tension to be, look at me, I'm the miracle worker. And he shows his humanity at many points as well, even within this narrative. Who touched me?
Right. And also in telling her parents, hey, she's probably hungry.
Yeah.
Give her something to eat.
Yeah.
I mean, can you imagine, your daughter has just been raised from the dead. You've got to be knocked out.
Yeah.
You've got to be in shock. And Jesus says, oh, don't forget to give her some lunch. So, yeah, just a practical concern for the humanity of this child.
Yeah. All right. I think that about does it for our episode. Again, if you want to read a verse for us, we would love that. Just email questions at thejesusdiscussion.com, put verse in the subject line, and we'll send you a verse to read. And you don't have to be an amazing radio personality. We're just looking for...
I'm proof of that.
Well, I got you ditto on that. So, look, but if you want to participate and have your voice over the airwaves on the podcasts, we would love that. We'd love to feature you. We thank you for listening and tuning in. Again, we are on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, SoundCloud.com/The Jesus Discussion. You can find all our sources at thejesusdiscussion.com. Thanks for tuning in, and we hope you have a wonderful week.